to go. Ashley's having some technical
Yep.
difficulties. So when you're ready to go, we're ready to go.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning, members and board staff and community that has logged in. I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. A couple of housekeeping items. Please remember to stay on mute when you are not speaking. If you'd like to speak, go ahead and push the hand icon. If for some reason you cannot find it or you're having trouble using it or we haven't seen it, then please just unmute and speak up when prompted. Be sure to contribute. So these meetings are a bit more informal than our traditional monthly meetings, meaning we welcome public comment on each agenda item, in addition, of course, to the subcommittee members' discussion and staff presentations. So if there's an agenda item you want to speak on, please make sure that we don't move on to the next agenda item without seeing your request. You could also put your request in the chat box to speak. Andrea, would you please do roll call?
Superintendent Designee Miller.
Good morning, I'm here.
Mr. Ruiz.
Here.
Mr. Stratton. Mr. Swanson.
Present.
You have a quorum.
Great. Our first agenda item is consideration of the consent agenda. Did we have any questions or comments regarding the consent agenda? Seeing and hearing none, I move to approve the consent agenda as presented. Can I get a second on that motion?
I'll second that.
All those in favor? Oh, yeah, no, Andrea, I think you take a roll call vote if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Ruiz.
Aye.
Mr. Swanson.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously.
Great. So moving on each agenda item this morning, I will do a small introduction, which will be followed by a staff presentation and then committee member questions, and then open the conversation to the wider members on the call. So in looking at agenda item C, our adjusted net income measure, you may have noticed in the public comment on our last agenda item, Stacy Crowell with Kingman Academy had asked us to remember to be cognizant of the ESSER cliff that's approaching for schools. And I know that we've heard this feedback a lot. And so it's our responsibility, I think, in this work to make sure, one, that we don't allow people to fail based on that cliff, but also that we're understanding, to that. And so one of my priorities for this committee and for this work and this updated framework has definitely been that we consider both the financial position of an organization over several years, its stability, in addition to considering, that one snapshot of the annual audit net income. So I think that ESSER is a great example of funds that schools receive in prior years or could have received in a prior year, but may expend in an upcoming or current year. Some other examples: donations, prior investments, equity, and reserves that schools have built. So using these funds could create a negative net income or a small loss in a current year. However, wouldn't in any way, signal distress for the organization. In fact, it could signal responsible spending as opposed to taking out a credit line at end of year. So also, considering that over 90, I think it's 95%, but to be fair, I'm going to say, to ensure accuracy, I'm going to say over 90% of the state's charter schools are nonprofits. So the nature of a nonprofit is to ebb and flow in this manner. Since this dashboard is so relevant to operators, I don't want it to discourage schools from spending in this way. And so with that in mind, I had asked that we prepare option 2 that we'll see in this staff presentation. It also addresses another priority of mine with this committee work, which is that small, even medium schools have a fair shot that the measures reflect outcomes that are commensurate and that are not impacted simply based on the size of their organization. So since smaller medium schools, if they choose to spend this money they have brought in other years, they're almost guaranteed to show a loss. A larger organization can adjust for that. So we'll have some more discussion after staff presentation. I just wanted to share those priorities and thoughts as we review the options. Andrea, you want to go ahead and jump in?
Sure. Subcommittee members, the adjusted net income measure, or ANI measure, considers whether a charter holder is operating within its available resources. Currently, the measure considers only 1 year of performance when assigning the rating. In September 2023, the Arizona Auditor General issued its sunset audit of the board. The sunset audit included one finding, which pertained to the board's financial framework. Among other things, the finding recommended the board add measures to its framework that assess financial health across multiple years, and specifically mentioned the total margin and aggregated 3-year total margin measure used by the Nevada State Public Charter School Authority. During its November meeting, the subcommittee discussed whether the ANI measure should consider multiple years of performance instead of the current one. During that meeting, the subcommittee considered Nevada's measure and the measure developed by the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, or NACSA. In November, the subcommittee also directed staff to solicit feedback regarding the subcommittee's proposed definitions for non-cash expenses and non-cash revenues. Additionally, the subcommittee voted to recommend the financial framework consider the change in net assets without donor restrictions instead of the current practice of using the total change in net assets. The subcommittee recommended that the board implement this change for those charter holders that would be positively affected, with staff's review of the fiscal year 2023 audits. On December 14, 2023, the full board approved the subcommittee's recommendation for the fiscal year 23 audits. Following its December meeting, the subcommittee directed staff to solicit feedback on a proposal that would provide flexibility for charter holders with a solid financial position to access their cash reserves without being penalized under the ANI measure and the lease adjusted debt service coverage ratio measure. The proposal considers whether the charter holder has at least 90 days of liquidity and has received a meet standard rating on the going concern and default measures. If these conditions are true, then instead of a calculated below standard rating, the charter holder will receive an approaches standard rating. And instead of a calculated approaches standard rating, the charter holder will receive a meet standard rating. After reviewing Nevada's and NACSA's measures, 4 options were developed for the subcommittee's deliberations, including 3 that consider multiple years' performance instead of the current one. The next slide for today's meeting provides a comparison of the 4 options. Please note that all 4 options incorporate the modifications already considered to the ANI measure by the subcommittee that I just mentioned. The difference between option 2 and option 3 is that under option 3, the charter holder cannot have a net loss, even a small loss, for the audit year and receive a meet standard rating. The options do not include one based on Nevada's measures. Staff appreciated the ease of determining a charter holder's performance under Nevada's measure. However, staff found the Nevada measure might lack the nuance necessary for the board's framework, which identifies those charter holders showing signs of financial risk and which, unlike Nevada's framework, may ultimately be used to make disciplinary decisions. At today's meeting, the subcommittee must choose one of the options included in the meeting materials or develop an option of its own. The subcommittee must also determine in which audit cycle the changes to the ANI measure will be implemented, and in which audit cycle the financial framework will consider the change in net assets without donor restrictions for all charter holders instead of those just positively affected. I'm available for questions.
Member Swanson, Member Ruiz, questions for Andrea to get started?
The donor restrictions, what could you define what a donor is?
Typically, my understanding of those is that for a lot of our charters, it relates to some of the grant funding that they receive or special funding that they receive, where the conditions of that funding or that funding may only be used for specific purposes. And so until they use the money for that purpose, those funds are restricted. It's not like their state equalization where they get that money and they can use it for any expense of the school. Those funds are restricted for a specific purpose and can only be used for that purpose.
Okay, so the donor is more of a term. It's more of like a revenue stream. It's a bucket of money. It's a bucket of funds.
Correct.
And so those bucket of funds are restricted use funds.
Right. And
Okay.
as the chairwoman mentioned earlier, sometimes the ability of the charter to be able to spend those funds in the same year, that just may not happen. And so that can kind of skew things when you get the money in one year and you spend it in a different year.
Okay, thank you.
Andrea, I know there's been, we prior approved applying that donor restrictions in a way that just positively impacted the charters this year. So we basically reviewed those that were benefited or represented better, with donor restrictions with donor, and those that represented better without. Was that a complicated process? Because I have, in researching this and talking to a couple of auditors, it seems that, and I'd love your opinion on this, it seems that it's slightly subjective, not in a bad way, just like they each interpret this a little bit differently. And so I don't know that there's a standard that makes sense, except for doing it the way you did it this year, but I'm curious your thoughts on that.
From staff's perspective, and again, we were waiting until the board made its decision, so we haven't actually reviewed anything. But based on the audits that we receive, it's very easy for us to be able to delineate that change in total net assets from the change in those without restrictions, because it's clearly identified in the audit itself. So there is no from our perspective, there is no interpretation or anything like that that is involved. It's clearly identified in the audit, and we base what we will be entering on what's in the audit. From prior conversations with schools, they had indicated that by us using the total change in net assets, so we would include with restrictions and without restrictions and just use that all together, that it would skew their performance and may not be evident or evidence of what they had actually done for that particular year. But what goes on behind the scenes during the audit to make those decisions as to where things fall, I can't speak to that.
But it would be feasible from a board staff perspective to apply the philosophy that was applied for fiscal year 23, where schools who benefit from having donor restrictions included, we could evaluate them that way, and those that benefit from having it excluded could be evaluated that way moving forward, or you think that would become a administrative burden?
It is feasible, whichever way the subcommittee decides. It does seem that at some point, and whether that is 24 or that is a later audit cycle, that if we are going to use the change without donor restrictions, that should be applied to all schools. But we have the ability as staff to, and it would not add complication either way, to transition all schools to using without donor restrictions or to continue um, using different amounts for different charters depending upon their situation.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm getting the donor restriction, given that we have ESSER funds, those might have been restricted funds, correct, Andrea? Would the ESSER funds have been considered restricted because they were given for a particular purpose of, I don't know, say, being used to get students up to speed from learning loss or something? And so are we trying? And I heard your comment about, you know, transitioning. Is the times that we're dealing with right now, because of there being so much government funding being placed in the education system, and that's eventually going to flush out. So you would, you know, I guess, what am I trying to say? If we get this framework and we have something right now, say 5 years from now, a lot of these restricted funds may be a little bit flushed out, and so you'd want to transition to where you're not considering it, or you know, we're trying to set up a framework here, but we have kind of some situations that maybe you know, one-time events that are going to be difficult to unravel or to consider in the future. I guess that's what I want to make sure that this, you know, this framework that we established today, you know, has some sort of longevity and doesn't cause problems, because restricted funds may be not such of an impact. Can you getting what I'm saying?
I think so, and I think part of this may get to part of what I believe you guys discussed at the last subcommittee meeting, and part of, I think, you're moving ahead, if I remember correctly, with this proposal was to collect data, and so it is possible for you today to decide that we need time to collect data. So we want to, I think we do need to make a decision today about FY24. That decision can be that you want to do the same thing that we're doing in FY23, so that schools are alerted to how things are going, because we will not have the FY23 data much before the end of this fiscal year. So there won't be data that you can use, and allow schools to have a heads up on which way you're going prior to the close of this fiscal year. So if that's the direction you would like to go, which is fine, you can kind of not make a decision about when to kick in using.
Utilizing the nearest exit or fire exit stairway.
I'm sorry, we're having a fire drill
Of course.
here. So
Are you
I'm
sure
gonna have to
it's real,
leave
Angela?
soon.
Because if it's not, we can wait.
I don't know what's going on here and how long this is going to take.
Attention.
But you can make that decision to kind of implement or continue what you're doing for 23 into 24, and then we can later come back and as a board or as a subcommittee, however you'd like to do it in a subsequent time period, make a decision as to how you'd like to proceed. I think I'm probably going to have to leave right now. So I'll be back as soon as possible, but please feel free to continue on if you can.
Got it.
And Member Miller,
Yes.
this is Ashley Berg.
Oh, hi.
Sorry, I think we're having a perfect storm today,
Right.
but I was not able to log in via Zoom, so I am on my phone. But I'll take over for Andrea. Just want to let you know that I'm all here.
Good,
I
I'm
was
glad you
able to
made it.
get on today.
And that you're
So,
safe.
Hey,
Um,
Ashley, you
we
are
can continue.
you are logged Ashley, this is Carlos. You are logged in twice. There is an Ashley Bird. It's not your face, but so you're on your phone. I think you might still be logged in on a PC though.
Yeah, my PC for some reason is not allowing me to
Okay.
access audio and visual,
Okay.
but my phone will. So I think we're good to move forward, Chairwoman Miller. So go ahead and move forward, and I'll be able to continue this meeting for you all. And again, so sorry for all of the issues that we're having right now.
Thanks. So it's important, subcommittee members and those that have logged in, to remember that we're kind of discussing two separate issues here. They've just fallen under the same agenda item. We may even want to consider separate motions on them. So we're considering, which option we want to move forward with for our net income measure. And then in addition to that, we're considering how we will approach this kind of nuance of donor restriction. So I want to open it up and see if we have public comment on either of those considerations. Let me see, I'm scrolling. Yes, John Snyder.
And thank you. Can you hear me? No,
I can.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll let you see me when I'm talking. Thank you, Chairman Miller. I just wanted to comment in general on the options. I don't know if I have a strong feeling about the donor piece. I do think the cash balance rating considerations that have been proposed by staff do address one of the concerns that folks have had about being able to expend funds that they perhaps had saved for years for a program that would then in the year spent cause the school to go negative on cash flow, but yet still be in strong financial shape because they had planned for it. So I'm in favor of that. I did want to comment on the options, and I did talk to Andrea about this, so she knows where I'm coming from. I don't like any of the options that include averages. In my opinion, time series averages can cause issues. They can penalize an improving school that's actually in good shape if it's accounting for, some maybe a bad or off year 2 or 3 years ago. And it can reward a weak school, a school that's weakening for the inverse reason. And while I appreciate that another authorizer and the national authorizer, as pointed out by some, think this is a good idea. I'd also note that, as many of you know, in my professional life, I financed nearly 300 charter bond issues, over $6 billion, selling those bonds to very sophisticated investors. And while my memory could fail me, I can tell you that either 100% or an overwhelming majority, near 100% of those bond covenants for coverage don't include time series, that those sophisticated investors want to see, what have you done lately? And so they don't look back at those at multiple years. And for those reasons, I don't think it's, in my opinion, it adds more complexity. And frankly, if you look at the results, the charts that Andrea had presented at the back, there's no material difference between any of the options in terms of outcomes of those schools that are deemed to be meeting, approaching, or below the standards. So, my thought would be, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Thank you.
Thank you for that feedback, John. I think I disagree on there's no significant impact. I see the small schools move in the right direction with this adjustment. I do agree that the larger you get, there's no material impact. And I think that's why it's important to provide this or option, right? So we're not saying that we don't want them to have a positive net income. That would be great. If they have a positive net income, they've met the standard. But I think it's critical that we provide an or they've established they're in a safe financial position. And to me, that's what this we could go with option 2, aggregate, if we're scared of averages. To me, that's what this option provides. Member Swanson?
A quick question for John. Did you, I know you said you didn't like averages. Did you all, and I don't know if I heard it or not, did you also dislike the aggregate?
I think the aggregate's nothing other than the averages, without,
So you dislike both?
yeah.
Okay.
And again, I think that, again, it can hide or veil schools that are going in one direction or the other, that shouldn't be viewed negatively or positively based on that direction. And again, I rely on, well, I share that this is not what the bond finance world looks at, for hundreds and hundreds of bond issues.
And I think that's a good delineation. I know I've spoken to some operators about, what the financer is looking at or should be looking at versus what the authorizer or oversee agency should be considering as far as whether they're in distress. I'm sorry, Member Swanson, were you still speaking?
No,
Thank
I
you.
mean, I do want to reiterate Wendy's point. If you look at Andrea's work on pages 7, 8, and 9, this is the medium and the large schools are really not impacted by this. They're, in essence, 95% or better success rate. And it's the small schools that are the most affected by this rating, which is on page 7. And the current world, they're just take FY. Sorry, I get backwards on reading this thing, but in FY22, roughly 88% or 86% for all 4 fiscal years, passed. In the other charts, it's almost 99%. So this is really about small schools. And, it doesn't, going from our current option to option 3 really doesn't change the numbers all that much in any year. So, I think, and I did have a discussion with Wendy about this, but so let's talk about what I think and I won't put words in your mouth, Superintendent Designee Miller, but I'll say that I think that Wendy wanted this smaller school population potentially not to be put in a position of making a bad decision to get a meets standard in either otherwise, somehow not spending money and not making a decision that might make them have a small negative margin. And so I think she was trying to look at that situation. And when, as Wendy stated before, and I don't know the number, but the large majority of our schools, our charters are not for profit. So Wendy, maybe if you could talk about kind of your concerns about schools making a bad decision and maybe, how do we address that in this measure?
Yeah, thank you, Member Swanson. I mean, to the point, if a small school, next fiscal year chooses to spend the ESSER funds that came in this fiscal year, they immediately are likely going to show a negative net income. There's absolutely no way around it because, our state equalization, it's just one piece of the puzzle, but it's primarily the revenue that's going to be visible each year. And so if we don't give any regard for their position prior to making that decision to say spend the ESSER, then we're going to evaluate them on the surface and say they have a loss. They're not operating within their means when in fact they're completely within their means. They're spending revenue that came in a different fiscal year. And so, option 1, our current formula, or option 3, incentivizes schools to make a decision to bring in another source of revenue in order to ensure that they stay positive, which cyclically doesn't make any sense at all. It's not a responsible way. I realize, we always want to see black on our audits. We always want to see schools trending upwards. However, we also want them to spend their own reserves. We want to consider the other items in their position and the fact that if they have a prior year donor, if they have anything from a prior year and they want to invest that in the current year, There needs to be some room for that. And there isn't if we only look at current net income. So if I don't want to lose the trust of my community, if I don't want to represent poorly on this dashboard, then ultimately I'm gonna seek another source of revenue that perhaps I don't need, which might mean entering into a line of credit or some other solution. Also want to point out that the margin here is very small. We're not encouraging with an option 2 choice. We're not encouraging schools to, just be negative and us not look at it. What we're encouraging is a very small, or allowing would be a very small loss, acknowledging that happens in the natural ebb and flow. Did that address your question, Member Swanson?
Yeah, I think that helped just kind of explain the issue. And I think like to hear from, whoever, if anyone has any thoughts.
Yeah, I know we have the Charter Association on the line, and I do feel that they wanted to make comment for this. Amanda, are you able to unmute?
Yes, maybe. How is that? Can you guys hear me?
Good morning. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I think our position is we have a very strong but very diverse portfolio of schools. And to your point, Wendy, there are a wide variety of contexts, and I think the board staff has done a really good job of looking at, over these past few fiscal years, looking at all of the different contexts and situations that charter schools have been in, looking at the small schools, the medium schools, large schools, and realizing that it's really hard to do kind of fit everybody in a one size fits all, but that's sort of what we need to do for a framework that's equitable to everybody. And like an option 2 that offers an or something that offers the flexibility that our schools need is something that that I think that we're always in favor of, is more flexibility to meet a wider range of diversity and challenges that our schools face.
Thank you for that feedback. Is that the sentiment that you've received when, speaking about this proposal with other operators? Have they expressed their support for an or?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a couple of conversations in which they have suggested, that the or just, again, they want flexibility and meeting a measure or the ability to meet it in a couple of different ways just feels, a little bit more equitable to them, especially on the smaller side.
Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. John? You got your hand up.
Yeah, just to lower my hand as well. And just to play the devil's advocate a little bit on my prior comments, I do agree, Wendy, that there's a fairly de minimis difference. While small schools do have lower ratios, that's not because of these formulas. It's just because of the nature of those schools and economies of scale. I think the real comparison here as to what the outcomes might be are looking at the small schools year over year versus each other. And it's basically a 3% differential between the current standard and the proposed ones. And I don't know how many schools were in the population of small schools, but I don't know, let's assume it's 200. That's 6 schools that impacts. It's just not material, which is part of my, if it's not broke, don't fix it argument. And I suspect, I could be wrong, but I suspect that some of that, if you note that options 2 and 3 are stronger outcomes in terms of meeting than the old one. I suspect that is in part because of the government subsidies that they've received over the last several years, ESSER monies, and that they actually may see the inverse happen as those monies go away when you use those averages. So I do, if I understand, if if option 1 and 2 were aligned with each other and allowed the or, I could see that being you know, providing that relief valve for those cases that you guys have been citing. But they aren't quite aligned in terms of the, you know, the percentage of the negative in the cases of negative outcomes.
I venture to think that the outcomes for those 6 schools are really relevant to them. John, so I think the operator.
Right, but again, you know, you're trying to create standards that are applied across 500 plus schools.
Right.
And you don't go
Right.
and it's worked for those schools in general over the last 5 years while they've been in place, in ways that have been tested as opposed to ways that are unknown. And so I'm just to offer that for consideration.
Thanks for your feedback, John. Do we have any other public members that would like to contribute to the conversation, or any other questions or comments from the committee? Yeah, Member Swanson.
Thanks. So, John, or actually, I don't know, Wendy, and, you know, because we are talking about, if you're looking at the small schools and you're looking at this, as John said, it's a fairly small number of schools that are impacted. And Wendy, you say that's you know, it doesn't really matter because an impact is an impact. What is it? And I guess this is for John, in the school finance world, or in the, you know, when people are looking or underwriting these operations, what does it mean if a school, these 5 schools, are approaching standard rather than meeting standard? Because that's where they would be, correct?
Well, yeah, Member Swanson, I'd love to speak to that first. I think sometimes with the board hat on, it might seem, you know, insignificant, but as the operator, it's very significant, right? We're educators. We always want to get an A. We want to reach that high level. And our communities, you know, this is a very public way of tracking our progress. And so that's why I think it's relevant that, you know, John's comment that a financer is going to look at a certain piece of the puzzle, and is going to react a certain way. So this isn't the finance metric. This is our dashboard that goes out that tells the community, you know, how we're doing, whether or not we're stable and whether or not we're at risk. And so to me, that's what the dashboard says. And once you approach, it's a sliding scale. And I think any goal we set as an authorizing agency that says every single quarter and every single year has to be positive is philosophically the wrong goal to set, because that is saying it's not okay to spend the money that you have developed over time, or that's in your reserve, or we don't trust you to make those decisions. I don't know if that answered your question. I see that Member Ruiz has his hand up. I'd really like him to be able to speak as well.
Thank you, Wendy. And then I'd like to hear from John on that.
Yeah. Okay.
I think because this measure, and we also have other measures that are finding risk, you know, when we get into some of these other agenda items. I think the next agenda item actually that has a measure in there that is will flag a charter operator. I think whether we use aggregate or average, I agree with Mr. Snyder that averaging or average, it's revealing the same thing. But I just because this measure, this thing that we're talking about right now, it is disparate between small, medium, and large. The small operators are probably not going out to the bond community for funding. You know, being a small operator of small business myself, I can't access that kind of stuff. So I have to show them, I have to use my own money, my own savings, go to the bank and try to get whatever, financing that I can. And so I think, I just kind of feel like this measure of being able to use reserves that somebody has to help them show that they are improving is the way to go. And we also have there's other performance measures that are going to flag things, and I think that's going to come out in the next agenda item. So that's just kind of my 2 cents on this agenda item.
Thank you, Member Ruiz. I see that we have some public comment, but before we move on, I want to circle back. Member Swanson, I believe there was a follow-up question. I apologize that you wanted John to speak to.
Yeah, thanks. John, I just wanted, like, if a school is meets or approaches, does that matter to somebody that's underwriting them for financing?
Generally not. From an outside financer's point of view, what they care is that you're largely in good standing, that you can continue to hold your contract, that you're not at risk of losing it. So they will, I think from the dashboard's perspective, more often they're just looking to see that we're below standard, where folks are in a below standard case and may be at risk of potentially losing their charter. Otherwise, they'll make their own assessment of the credibility of a school based on the measures that they typically use. I guess one last thing I just want to raise, again, playing devil's advocate. I wonder how much the averaging is especially in the small schools, improving people's outcomes in these in the statistics that Andrea's prepared, as opposed to the margin levels. For approaches, the margin that was approached now is 0 to 5. Well, now it's -5 or up to -10, right? And then below standard was more than 5 below under the existing one, and now it's up to 10. So I'm not sure even whether it's the averaging that's improving those results as opposed to the percent measure, allowing them to be even more negative. And part of it, and again, this, I don't have to do it. Part of it is that, it's more complicated, and I question whether it's really surfacing, the issues that the board wants to oversee at the expense of, Andrea having to calculate multiple forms of this. And if that's the case, that it's so simply because you've slid the percentages to where they can be more negative and still meet it, then maybe the simplistic approach is just is an option 2A, which doesn't have the averages but only has the changed percentages. And again, I don't have a strong feeling. I just want to make sure that all these things are surfaced for consideration. I think that's part of my role as technical advisor.
It's relevant that anyone who moved into the meets standard was impacted directly by the OR, because yes, the margins changed for approach and below, but our current net income measure and option 3's proposed measure make no change to the meet standard. So it is the OR that's moved those small schools over to the left. We do have one comment in the chat box. For those who can't see chat box, Amy Seiler, it's not working and is currently broken, with all due respect to Mr. Snyder. I don't know if Amy wants to speak, or just I wanted to make sure her comment was heard. Amanda, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just had a question. I think it's similar to Mr. Ruiz's question. It might be for Andrea or anybody who wants to jump in. Is how does this measure, adjusting this, say we go with like an option 2 where you're giving a school an OR, how does that work in conjunction with us increasing the cash on hand for schools and small schools? Because if you're increasing cash on hand, does this OR then play a little bit more of a role in helping schools, you know, meet the framework options, or yeah, how do we see those two working in conjunction with each other?
Thank you for that question. I'll let Andrea think about if she's got a take on it. I'm not sure that they necessarily play together. You know, we have prior approved a couple of exceptions for, you know, for these standards, right? Kind of like we do under the ADM. If you meet a certain criteria, if you meet XYZ, then you can move up one measure if you approach or fall below over here. And so one of those involves having 90 days cash on hand. So if a small or medium school, because those are really, again, the ones that are most impacted, were to say, you know, overspend and show a negative net income for the year, but after that spending they still had, you know, 90 days cash on hand, then this committee has already voted to provide them like a one-time gimme, right, like an adjustment. I think 90 days cash on hand is really high, right? Our goal for the framework in general moving forward is at 45, so that would mean those schools have doubled. Which means, you know, they'd have to have a lot of cash on hand to exercise that exception. If you put that exception in play with this, or then you have really created kind of that parachute that I was hopeful to see for small and medium schools to make that decision for themselves as businesses, rather than with the pressure of the measures. I don't know, Andrea, if you have a different like, so the liquidity is on the 90 days liquidity is on the exception. This would be more about the stability of the, so then we're looking at both. We're looking at, you know, schools that have the 90 days have an exception, and then over here, schools that are in a really good financial position for multiple years would also be able to spend their reserves. Andrea, did you want to speak to that one too?
I guess the only thing I would add to that from a more general perspective is that the net income of the school is what drives those cash reserves. I mean, yes, the schools can borrow, and they can, if they have that option of having related parties or whatever, they may be able to have those transfer of funds and to be able to rely on that related party. But generally speaking, the adjusted net income measure affects the day's liquidity measure in terms of that is how the schools can either build up or build back up their reserves.
Any other questions or comments, either from subcommittee or the public?
Wendy, just a thought, and you know, we're kind of going around and around on this, but here's a thought. What if we changed meets to just say, and there would have to be some refinement, maybe send this back, but meets is adjusted net income is greater than or equal to $1 in 2 out of the last 3 years, where any year that it's negative, it can't be more than X.
Yeah, member Swenson, I think, I mean, is it a little, it's definitely a wording adjustment. I'm not sure that philosophically it's significantly different than what we're proposing now. Is it the aggregate you're trying to avoid, or?
I'm just trying to get the or out of there, so that there's just one criteria for meeting. And it's your positive 2 out of 3 years, and your negative year can't be more than X.
I think that might complicate it for schools that don't have the 3 years, like the or eases the calculation if they don't have the 3 years available.
Okay.
Any other comments? As mentioned previously, I think it makes sense to separate out our intentions with the donor restrictions. So I'd like to throw out a motion and see if the subcommittee is there. I would move that the adjusted net income measure proposal be incorporated into the subcommittee's recommendation to the board using option number 2 aggregated as presented today and found in the materials for today's meeting, and that the proposal be implemented with the fiscal year 24 audits.
And is there a second?
I'll second that. This is Carlos Reese.
Thank you, Mr. Ruiz. Superintendent does it. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Ruiz. How do you vote?
Yes. Aye.
Mr. Swanson.
Uh,
Thank you.
I'm going to vote yes, but I'd like to make a comment. I think that you know, this is about small schools and listening to the charter community, you know, giving them some flexibility so that they don't fall into a trap or a perceived trap is probably a decent idea. And so I vote yes.
Superintendent Designee Miller.
I vote yes.
With that, motion passes.
Thank you. Thank you for that support, subcommittee members. And as all items that we're looking at now, we can revisit them if we've gone down the wrong path later, we have the opportunity to revisit them as a board and adjust them. So I wanted to make a separate motion before we move to the next agenda item in regards to the donor restrictions. I would move that beginning with fiscal year 24 audits, the subcommittee recommends the financial performance framework. Consider the change in net assets without donor restrictions for all charter holders that are positively affected, and with donor restrictions for all charter schools that are positively affected, using the separate calculations. Subcommittee will consider finalizing this recommendation under agenda item E on today's agenda. Once approved by the subcommittee, the recommendation, including the changes to the adjusted net income measure previously identified, will be released for the first opportunity for public comment in accordance with the board's procedures for rule and policy adoption. Andrea, Ashley, did I say that right? What I'm going for here is that we move forward into fiscal year 24 with what we did for the schools in fiscal year 23.
I think your motion is clear on the intention. With that, is there a second?
Oh, this is Carlos Reese. I'll second.
Mr. Ruiz?
I vote aye.
Mr. Swanson?
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, moving on to agenda item D, which is factors affecting days liquidity. And got lots of comments on that, but I think we will start with we've discussed this a little bit during the prior agenda item, but I will pass to Andrea for a presentation on this agenda.
Subcommittee members, the financial framework's current unrestricted days liquidity, or UDL measure, focuses on how many days liquidity the charter holder has, but doesn't consider how the charter holder derived that liquidity. Charter holders may access credit lines, transfer funds between related schools or entities, or obtain advances from an outside party on their state equalization payment. The latter is referred to as factoring. Unlike cash generated from the charter holder's operations, amounts obtained from credit lines, fund transfers, or factoring will have to be repaid at some point in the future. The fact that these funds must be repaid is currently not addressed under the financial framework. At its November and December meetings, the subcommittee discussed whether a charter holder's use of credit lines, fund transfers between related parties, and/or factoring should be taken into account under the framework. For this presentation, these three items will be referred to collectively as either short-term borrowed funds or short-term borrowing. Based on previous discussions, staff prepared an updated proposal, which has been included on the next slide for today's meeting. If approved by the subcommittee, the components of this proposal would be incorporated into the subcommittee's recommendation to the full board for the UDL measure and would likely be implemented with the fiscal year 2024 audits, but that is the subcommittee's determination. Under the proposal, for a charter holder that uses short-term borrowing to avoid a below standard rating, the short-term borrowed funds will be removed to determine the charter holder's performance on the UDL measure. For example, for the fiscal year 2024 audit cycle, should this be implemented for that cycle, a charter holder will receive a below standard rating if it does not have 15 days liquidity without the use of short-term borrowed funds. For charter holders that have at least 15 days liquidity with short-term borrowing removed, the short-term borrowed funds will be taken into account when assigning the rating. This proposal ensures that charters most at risk are identified and that there is flexibility for charters to borrow short-term. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Member Reese, Member Swanson, do you have questions for Andrea?
Andrea, I have no questions, and I thought this proposal actually works and is quite well done. So it's my opinion or comment, not opinion.
My comment, the tables were are very well compiled and understandable, and it goes to my point, especially when that one table and the paragraph that you have on factoring, it shows, from 2019 to 2022, factoring has come down, is good, but then this goes to my point that in your last sentence, 3 of the 4 charter holders identified in 22 have borrowed funds through factoring for all 4 years. So those are the kind of, I think, measures that would catch someone in trouble, and it would help to catch those, and goes to, yeah, it just goes to my point previously that that these are the kind of things that as the charter oversight is going to find and identify those charter holders that are struggling. So yeah, I like the proposal.
Do we have questions or comments from the public on this agenda item? Amanda?
Yeah. Yeah, so my first question, Andrea, is 2 things. Well, I guess I have a statement and a question. First, my statement is like, just like everybody else, we don't want our schools, no matter how big or small they are, factoring. It's just not good business practice. And, I know that the board staff wants to help, intervene and catch those schools so that they can offer the right assistance. We want to offer the right support if we can. But my question is, on the fund transfers, can you speak to that a little bit? Because again, we have a really diverse portfolio, and some of our medium to larger schools that might, that have grown from a single site, really do benefit from being able to transfer cash, from one entity to the other. So I was just hoping that you might be able to speak to that a little bit, clarify it for me, what the proposal is.
Yeah, and so yes, with those transfers, we are really looking at between the related parties. We are looking at short-term borrowing. So there are a variety of ways that related parties can move those funds around. That kind of sounds negative, but transfer those funds around or distribute those funds. And so what we are really looking at, and what this, if approved by the subcommittee, what this would consider is short-term borrowing. So anything that is a current liability but is more of a loan than the other mechanisms that they may have available to them to do that. If the related party has a long-term loan that was set up for cash flow purposes, that would not be considered under here because it would already be taken care of under the ratio measure as they are paying back that principal. So this is really focused on, I guess, short-term loans between related parties, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Andrea, because I think we would prefer to keep factors affecting days liquidity constrained really to factoring. But for schools that have really worked hard to grow, being able to transfer funds seems equitable to them, and like they would have the right to implement that in their business practices and benefit from some of their economies of scale.
Amanda, I appreciate that comment, and I tend to agree. I feel like under the net income measure, we've now provided flexibility where we've removed some of the pressure for short-term income to cover these gaps. So to me, and I'd be interested to hear how my subcommittee members feel about it. To me, the red flag here is the factoring. It's very dangerous to our schools, and we don't want to sign off on it in these measures. I feel like we've lessened the need to monitor the short-term borrowing based on the decisions that we've made prior today. But I know my subcommittee members expressed their support for this measure, so I'm curious how you guys feel about that. No feedback? Okay. I'm going to defer over here to the chat box. Amy Seiler has mentioned that she apologizes. Her mic is not functioning. In regards to fund transfers, is there a time limit to request, or is it live? And is there oversight as far as approving the request in real time? Or is it something that is done without approval per se, then discussed at a later time when discovered? I apologize, Amy. I'm not completely sure that I understand the context of the question.
Ms. Miller, I can maybe attempt to respond, but I think, Amy, if I am understanding your question correctly, our board does not have any decision-making authority with regard to an individual charter's wanting to enter into an agreement or transferring of funds. That is a charter's sole responsibility, and they have the sole authority to make those decisions. We would not get involved in any of that decision making. When it would show up as if it was disclosed in the audit, and that charter had already made that decision, and how that monies would be transferred, or however that agreement has been established, that's when it would show up in the charter's audit, and then ultimately shown in the financial framework and on that charter's dashboard. That answers your question.
Thank you, Ashley. I see also Katie McMillan, and I'm not sure, Katie, if you can unmute your mic. There's a question: how will you identify a short-term related party loan on the financial statements as opposed to related party transfer associated with accounts payable or payroll?
Yeah, so all of our related party transactions, if it's will appear as a current liability. And I just want to make sure that we're not looking at that specific line on the financial statements, which includes a lot more than potential, short-term cash movements. Because it can include just regular operating activity. So I'm wondering how you identify something that might be what we're considering a related party loan as opposed to just the regular operating activity.
Typically, while the financial statements may have limited disclosure, or the face of the financial statements may have limited disclosure, the notes will help delineate between what is accounts payable versus what is a cash flow loan for the entity. So we will not be including accounts payable or payroll expense or other things that may be identified as a current liability at June 30th. We will be looking and focusing only on those cash flow loans that are identified in the audit that are current. And again, we will not include the current portion of a long-term loan. We will just be looking at those short-term cash flow loans, but we will not be including accounts payable or any of those types of things. And again, if your audit currently groups all of that stuff into one line item and there isn't disclosure, it might be beneficial to work with your auditor to make it very clear, at least in the notes, if those amounts are just accounts payable or accrued payroll, that's what those amounts are, and that that they don't include other things, so there isn't any point of confusion or need for clarification, if that would be of help to your school.
Andrew, would you mind scrolling down in this report and spending just a minute discussing the summary of numbers, like the incidences of these transfers that you had documented in the report for today's meeting?
So are you wanting to look at some of the tables?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so at this point in time, and as noted in the staff report, we did not readily have available any information related to those fund transfers related or between related parties, excuse me. But what we did look at in the staff report and summarize were the other sources of liquidity under our current calculation for unrestricted days liquidity. It adds back other sources of liquidity, and these are the items that are currently considered. So credit lines, investments, certain bond reserves, and just to note in our in the subcommittee's current proposal, the investments continue. And we've also added in, or the subcommittee has also added in amounts due from government entities. Under our current practices, staff enters in the credit line amount. So most of our schools under the current practices do not draw down their credit line because they know that we will enter it in. So if you could go to I think the next slide. This kind of gives, takes that information that was on the previous slide and kind of rolls it up into occurrences by the type of other liquidity that was used. And so you can see that in total, staff entered the credit line amount for 72 charter holders, and the charter holder used all or part of their credit line in 6 instances. So for the bulk of what is currently happening, the schools aren't drawing that down because they know we will enter in that full amount. Then we have kind of the breakdown of investments bond reserves and due from trustee. And with the changes that were made to the payment, the due from trustee is not as applicable anymore, as the school's last payment is no longer on June 30th or the last business day of the month. Under the proposal that is being considered by the subcommittee today, schools would still be allowed, if they wanted to draw down their credit line. And that credit line that they drew down would remain in the calculation so long as they did not use that credit line to get themselves out of a below rating. So for fiscal year 2024, for example, that below threshold is 15 days. So if the charter holder used the credit line to get them to at least 50 days or 15 days, excuse me, then we're under the proposal, we would back out the credit line amount. If we back out the credit line amount and the charter holder's at 20 days, we're going to add that back in. So we're going to allow you to use the credit line to, if you want, to move yourself in further into approaches, or maybe bump yourself up to meets. We're going to allow that. But if you are using your credit line to get yourself out of a below standard rating, then that is when we are going to turn around and back that out. And the same is true for the transfers, the related party transfers, and the factoring as well. I don't know if that really got to what you were looking for, Chairwoman, but I can try again if not.
Thank you. No, that was really helpful. Any other questions, comments? I'm a little torn on this agenda item, to be honest, with my subcommittee, because I can hear the complexities of trying to apply this. I do agree that, just like I wanted the flexibility for the small schools, I agree that once you've built an economy of scale, you should have the ability to use it. So for me here, the priority is factoring. And that's what I would be prone to include in a motion, but I also want to be respectful of the opinion of my subcommittee. So I'm hesitant.
I think we should just count the factoring, allowing large entities to move funds back and forth. I think some of these other measures that we look at, they have the financial scale and wherewithal to move money around, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It's kind of reality. I think just like in the previous agenda item, this particular issue is trying to find shortcomings, and I think that's where this by putting in factoring, that's where it's going to help to find some of these shortcomings.
Thanks for that feedback, Maurice. All right, so I'll give this a shot and see where we're at. I would move that the proposal to consider underlying factors affecting charter holders' days of liquidity. Let's see. As presented today and found in the materials for today's meeting, be incorporated into the subcommittee's recommendation to the board for the unrestricted days liquidity measure, with the modifications discussed today to include only the factoring, and that the proposal be implemented with the fiscal year 2024 audits. The subcommittee will consider finalizing its recommendation under agenda item E on today's agenda, Once approved by the subcommittee, the recommendation, including these changes to the unrestricted days liquidity measure, will be released for the first opportunity for public comment in accordance with the board's procedures for rule and policy adoption.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. Mr. Ruiz.
I'm going to vote aye, and I'd also like to point out, previously, Andrea just also mentioned that it's not just the factory, and we're voting on that, but there are mechanisms also in place where she's saying you can't, we already have these where somebody using a credit line to try to bump themselves over 15 days. I mean, that's going to that's just another layer. So I think there's some pretty good adequate measurements here to capture charter holders that are struggling. So that's why I vote aye, especially on the factory.
Mr. Swanson.
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller.
I vote aye, and I just want to thank Andrea for her work on this proposal. Even though we're implementing a part of it, the work was fantastic, and I know it was extensive.
Thank you. Motion passes.
All right, thank you. Moving on to agenda item E. I'm proud of the work we've done thus far. I think we had a great financial framework going into this, and I think we've made some minor modifications that look nice. And that is our next agenda item, is to consider, the work that's been done thus far and what will be pushing forward to the larger board and community to review. Andrea?
Subcommittee members, over the past several weeks, the subcommittee has held 3 meetings. Staff has compiled the actions taken by the subcommittee at those meetings into a draft of the subcommittee's recommendation to the full board. If the subcommittee approves its recommendation today, the next step would be for the proposal to go out for public comment for a full 20 days prior to bringing it to the full board for its consideration. The staff report for this agenda item includes the subcommittee's draft recommendation for all 6 measures. Screenshots from the staff report have been made into slides for today's meetings. As these slides may be a bit hard to read, as I go through this presentation, I will also identify the page in the staff report where the information may be found. Let us know if you would prefer that instead of the slides we use the staff report, which is a little easier to zoom in on. The next slide for today's meeting and page 6 of the staff report address the going concern measure. No changes to this measure have been recommended by the subcommittee. The next slide and page 7 of the staff report address the default measure. The subcommittee has recommended adding an approaches standard rating to address a situation where the lender or landlord has allowed a charter holder to pause or reduce payments for a period of time under a forbearance or similar agreement. The new option is not applicable to a charter holder that proactively and voluntarily works with its lender or landlord to renegotiate loan or lease terms. The next slide addresses part of the subcommittee's recommendation for the unrestricted days liquidity measure. This information may also be found on page 8 of the staff report. The formula used for calculating charter holders' performance on this measure has been modified to more accurately and fairly represent the resources available to the charter holder and to more closely align with the disclosure required by accounting principles in most charter holders' audits. The recommended formula considers charter holders' unrestricted cash, amounts due at year-end from government entities, and unrestricted investments. Regarding definitions, the definition for non-cash expenses has been modified to encompass all non-cash expenses identified in the audit. In addition, definitions for unrestricted cash and unrestricted investments have been added. The next slide and pages 8 and 9 of the staff report capture changes made to the measure rating targets. The meet standard target has been increased from the current 30 days to 45 days, and the below standard target has been increased from the current 15 days to 30 days. These recommended changes will be phased in over multiple audit cycles, with full implementation occurring with the fiscal year 2027 audits. Although not reflected on these slides, the subcommittee's recommendation will also include the action taken earlier today regarding factoring. The next slide addresses certain recommendations related to the adjusted net income measure. This information may also be found on page 10 of the staff report. As mentioned under a previous agenda item, to provide flexibility for charter holders with a solid financial position to access their cash reserves and not be penalized under the framework, the measure has been updated to take into account charter holders' days liquidity as determined under the unrestricted days liquidity measure and performance on the going concern and default measures. In addition, the definition for non-cash expenses has been modified to encompass all non-cash expenses identified in the audit. Further, a definition has been added for non-cash revenues. Although not reflected on this slide, the subcommittee's recommendation for the adjusted net income measure will also include the action taken earlier today related to the calculation, rating, and calculation considerations. The next slide addresses part of the subcommittee's recommendation for the lease-adjusted debt service coverage ratio measure. The information may also be found on page 11 of the staff report. Under the recommendation, the definition for debt principal has been modified to exclude principal payments associated with equipment or vehicle finance leases. These types of leases were previously referred to as capital leases. The next slide in pages 11 and 12 of the staff report capture changes made to account for when a charter holder pays off debt early, is subject to a balloon payment, or refinances all or some of its debt in the audit fiscal year. The next slide and page 12 of the staff report reflect the flexibility provided for charter holders with a solid financial position as determined under the unrestricted days liquidity, going concern, and default measures to access their cash reserves and not be penalized under the framework. The next slide addresses part of the subcommittee's recommendation for the average daily membership measure. This information may also be found on pages 13 and 14 of the staff report. The classification of charter holders based on their ADM has been eliminated. This results in all charter holders being evaluated with the same threshold, which is the threshold currently used for small and medium-sized charter holders. To capture large decreases in ADM, a second formula has been added that considers the charter holder's change in ADM in the most recent 3-year period. To put this in context, for the fiscal year 2024 audits, a charter holder's rating on this measure will consider the average of the charter holder's annual growth rates for fiscal years 2022, 2023, and 2024, and the charter holder's change in ADM from fiscal year 2022 to fiscal year 2024. The measure's rating adjustment has been changed to meet standard in all situations instead of the current practice of only increasing the rating by one category. This means as long as the charter holder receives no below standard ratings and no more than one approaches standard rating on the financial framework's other 5 measures, the charter holder would receive a meet standard on the average daily membership measure, regardless of the charter holder's calculated average or change in ADM. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Do we have any questions? Any comment? Amanda?
I'd like to jump in. My only comment on all of this is really just thank you all, everybody, the board staff, the board superintendent designee Miller. You guys have all just done such a really good job of trying to be so thorough and considerate of the diversity of the portfolio, new schools starting up, small schools, large schools. And we just really appreciate the time and the effort that you're putting in, and Andrea, all the work that you have done to just help everybody have a good understanding of all of these proposed changes. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you too for your participation and soliciting feedback for us from the schools in the field so that we could get it right. Any other comments, questions? All right. Seeing and hearing none. Let's navigate between my screens here. I move that the subcommittee accept the proposed changes to the financial performance framework measures and the implementation schedule as presented today and found in the materials for today's meeting, including the changes to the adjusted net income measure and unrestricted days liquidity measure approved by the subcommittee today under agenda items C and D, and recommend that the full board adopt these changes. Further, I move to direct staff to solicit public comment on the subcommittee's recommendation in accordance with the board's procedures for rule and policy adoption, and to place the matter on the board's February 12th, 2024 agenda at the earliest for the second opportunity for public comment and consideration and possible action by the full board. If the feedback received during the first opportunity for public comment warrants further deliberation by the subcommittee, I direct staff to schedule another subcommittee meeting prior to the recommendation being placed on the agenda for the full board's consideration.
Thank you. And do we have a second?
I'll second that. This is Carlos Reese.
Mr. Reese? Okay, Mr. Reese, how do you vote?
I vote aye, and thank you, Andrea, for, I know we've had some, I've had some calls with you and you've explained things very well. Same with you, Ashley. I'm looking at this list and oh my gosh, that is a lot of stuff. That's a lot of stuff that we've done over the last few months. So thank you, and I vote aye.
Thank you. Mr. Swanson?
Ditto on Member Ruiz's comments. Great job. Thank you. You guys are so knowledgeable. Aye.
And Superintendent Designee Miller?
I vote aye.
Thank you. And motion passes.
I see that I skipped over an agenda item. Thank you for, I guess, allowing that or not calling me out. We had the performance dashboards, agenda item F. Are we able to circle back and do that, or do we need to? We're informal enough to do that. Good. Okay. This agenda item, we've done a lot of work as we've been discussing today to provide the needed flexibility in this framework. But truly nobody knows why a decision is made better than the organization or the school themselves. So this agenda item is to consider providing a space on all of our performance dashboards, including this financial, where the charter could respond or make a statement so that the public could see their feedback on why they're falling where they fall on the metric. That was the intent of this agenda item. Andrea?
Subcommittee members, as the chairwoman mentioned, at a prior meeting, the subcommittee requested charter representatives be allowed to include a brief explanation with each of the performance dashboards in the board's new online portal. This functionality existed for the financial dashboard in the prior online system, but is not currently in the board's online portal. This item is on the agenda today so that we can provide you with an update. Our developer has indicated that this functionality is possible, and we have informed them to proceed with this work. The developer plans to deploy the functionality for the financial dashboard this month, and the functionality for the academic and operational dashboards is under development. As this is an update, there is no action to be taken today by the subcommittee, and I'm available for questions.
Any questions, comments?
I just have a quick comment. I just want to thank you for your work on this. This is something that we have very much repeatedly heard from many charter leaders, is that, their context and their decisions, they just want to be able, especially on that public facing, to be able to give some context to people who might be reading about, why there might be a ding or something lower than a green or a meets on their performance dashboards, and that it really just does honor their voice in their unique context. So thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you, Andrea, and board staff for moving forward on that request, and we look forward to that opportunity. I think with that, we can move on to agenda item G for potential public comment or comment from the subcommittee for any future items that would require another subcommittee meeting or they'd like to see. Seeing none and hearing none, I will echo some of the prior comments. I just want to thank the stakeholders. They have invested a lot of time. We've seen a lot of names attend each of our meetings and reach out to us and make public comment. Want to thank the technical panel for the time they committed and their feedback. Especially want to thank our subcommittee members and the board staff with a loud shout out for Andrea. Not sure some days how she trudges through, but the work that's been applied here is greatly appreciated and has been very meaningful for a lot of us. If we have no other feedback on this agenda item, then I believe we're ready to transition to agenda item H, a summary of current events, future meeting dates, and items for future agenda. I believe in our couple of agenda items back, we summed it up that the next step here is that this transitions to our full board. Ashley, I see that you've unmuted.
Yes, that is correct. So we do plan to put this proposal out for public comment in the next week or so. That will be out for public comment for 20 days, like you guys had already approved. And then we will bring it back as indicated in that motion at the February meeting, which I believe is February 12th. And with that, I do want to update the subcommittee that our January 8th meeting, our full board meeting, has been canceled due to not having any amendments on the agenda. And so we will be moving all business over to February at this time. But that is all that I have to report to you right now. And happy to see you all, and just want to say thank you all for your participation. I know that this was a lot of time that each of you, not only the charter stakeholders have put into this, but also the subcommittee members. And I know Andrea and I really appreciate your feedback and the meaningful conversation. So thank you. And with that, Chairwoman, that's all I have to report.
Thank you. Well, I think my brain is full. So unless we have anyone else with an important comment, I believe we are ready to adjourn.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Talk to you soon.
Bye.